7 months ago, in these very rooms, we launched the project. And I said at that time that we lived in a very messy, very complicated, increasingly dangerous and yet interconnected world, and that there was never a clearer need, perhaps, to have leadership on our planet. The intervening 7 months have done much to confirm exactly that analysis, and therefore the work that has been done by the panels over that 7 months is not just good and commendable, it is hugely valuable and will in the long term be of great assistance to the generation who have to face the problems today. And we're publishing 16 reports with another one on the way. And these reports, as I said 7 months ago, are not simply an analysis of how bad the world is or how complex or how dangerous the world is, but it seeks to answer the so what question, the and therefore question that leaders pose. And therefore they analyse the problem and the problems, and they are myriad, but they also dig deep to find and to suggest some solutions to it. And one of them in particular, in one of the reports, suggests that leadership training should really be a foundation subject in our schools.
What struck me reading these fascinating reports is how incredibly dangerous and unpredictable the world is now, but yet how inadequate, according to the reports, the leadership is. The Thinking the Unthinkable report, which I thought was particularly interesting, talks about an executive myopia at the top of organisations, both business and government, and a failure not just to predict what are known as the black swan events, but also to not understand that there are black elephants in the room, issues that are there and always there but not confronted. So it was not just thinking the unthinkable, the report concluded, but not thinking about the unpalatable.
What I think we are all aware of is a refugee crisis, and climate change is a driver of refugees driven from regions of the world that will no longer be habitable into regions of the world that are already overpopulated. And that's, I think, one of the big challenges that we are facing. So when I describe climate change as the biggest political and diplomatic challenge of our time, it's a challenge primarily because of the magnitude of the challenge, but it's also a challenge because it's a slow-burning fuse. They're all involved in raising awareness of the challenge at this point in time. My biggest fear is that as soon as Paris is finished and the meeting is done, people will rub their hands and say, let's move on to the near-term issues again. We've conducted a risk analysis, and that's one of the reports that we've made, and that risk analysis takes a reinsurance view of climate change, and we worked with leaders in China, India, the United States, and Britain. And when I say leaders from the reinsurance side, but also leaders from the climate science side and political advisors, politicians, admirals and generals. So we engaged the whole community. And the conclusion of the risk report, and I hope that some of you will go to that report, is that we are on a pathway, even given agreement in Paris, towards a 3.5, 4 degrees centigrade world just this century. And anything above a 2 degrees centigrade world is going to challenge us with enormous risks. So when I say risks, the risks we asked each country to put forward were what was the worst that climate change could throw at them, and then we analysed the risk going forward in time. So I just take one example, the failure of all 3 rice crops in China in 1 year. And while that is a less than 1% chance today, as we move towards even a 2 degrees centigrade world, that rises to a 1% chance in a given year. 1 in a 100-year event is not the sort of event that most governments would really like to face up to. These are risks that we really have to manage downwards. A second report also deals with an aspect of climate change from the science side, and this is looking at our eating habits. And you may say, what on earth has that got to do with climate change? But of course, what we're seeing is this rapid emergence of a new global middle class. 1 billion people in the year 2000, past 2 billion in the year 2013. That doubling happening very much in the Asia-Pacific region. And middle-class people around the world have aspired to similar dietary habits. And so much more beef is being consumed around the world. Now, if we look at South America, we see that roughly there's 1 beef-producing animal per hectare. And as we then look at this in terms of water consumption, it's about 12,000 litres per kilogram of beef to produce. Now, quite frankly, as we move on towards 2030, just 15 years away, when the figure is expected to be 4.5 billion middle-class consumers on the planet's surface, we're not going to be able to produce the beef. Or if we do, we have a very short timeline afterwards because we will have taken out the forests of South America in order to produce the beef to meet demand.
I mean, we meet today when Francis Maude's report is being circulated in Whitehall about the culture of Whitehall, and we talked quite a lot about that. Because there is a sense in which Whitehall is very good at coordinating. An awful lot, as people in this room well know, an awful lot of emotional and physical effort goes into coordinating. And sometimes what can be coordinated is the policy, not necessarily what is the right policy. So sometimes we have beautifully coordinated policy which is incoherent. Its output is incoherent, but it's beautifully coordinated. We're better than our partners at doing that, and we're noted for it in the international world. It doesn't always work that way, but sometimes it does. And that's one of the virtues and vices, I think, of the UK system. And so, in relation to this question of thinking the unthinkable, which the intelligence services in particular have a responsibility to try to do, I think we thought a lot about that. We live in a world of tremendous change. Of course we do. In the Middle East, there are 2 states collapsing. There are 2 states, or claiming to be states, arising. And that will, if this crisis goes on, it'll be 3 or 4 states collapsing and 2 or 3 states claiming statehood. So the Middle East is changing in front of us. In Europe, we see Europe. There's nothing new in what's going on in Europe, but we thought we'd banished these sort of politics from Europe a generation ago. It's old politics coming back. These changes are not conceptually new. We know what's going on, but things which are conceptually new, these, as it were, the black swans and the black elephants that the Thinking the Unthinkable report has looked at, I think are very important. So the social media and the alternative political articulation in world politics is really interesting. There are more people now in the world who own phones than have bank accounts. If you assume there's 4.5 billion people with bank accounts, you assume, therefore, if you've got a bank account, you've got a stake in your society in some way, more people own phones. And 2 billion of those 4.5 billion people who own phones, same number as bank accounts, actually have smartphones. So it creates more, as it were, international political articulation than necessarily than people have a stake in society. There's new things going on. Throughout Europe, the traditional parties are soaking up only 65% of the popular vote, whereas they were soaking up 85% of the popular vote only 10 or 15 years ago. Things are changing. That's a conceptually new development. Another conceptually new development is the way the world economy is creating completely new dynamics. 25 years ago, there was about the same amount of money chasing world output. Now, 25 years later, there's about the same amount of world output, but 3 times as much money, core financial assets, chasing about the same amount of output around the world. So there's a third revolution of capitalism going on, which is about finance. It's all about finance. That's conceptually new. Or digitization. We live in digital society, huge amounts of data, which can be used and manipulated. And data is changing the sort of people we are, changing the sort of citizens we are. Those are all conceptual challenges. They're changing political processes more than what's happening in the Middle East or Europe are changing our day-to-day politics. And the task of intelligence services is somehow to keep on top of intelligence in the traditional sense, but also to keep on top of the conceptual challenges. And that's something I think which this project, I think, has tried to outline. And Churchill himself, I mean, he wasn't a great process man, he was an outputs man. He followed processes when he thought he had to, but he was much more concerned with outputs than processes. And somehow we might have got ourselves too locked into processes instead of outputs, and we need to shift the balance towards outputs. Most of our international institutions are 20th century creations, and it's not surprising. I mean, most of them arose out of that post-war environment of 1945 to the 1960s, and they developed in that way. It's not completely hopeless, of course, because there's lots of good arrangements in the world. People are not stupid, and they make their own arrangements. But we're halfway towards new institutions in the sense that there are patterns of behaviour which are being codified through, for instance, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a good example now of new trade arrangements and liberalisation and harmonisation in the Pacific, the TTIP applying to Europe. These are examples within the World Trade Organization. There's lots of arrangements being made, but they're not really quite being institutionalised. And when they come up against the institutions, they're coming up against 20th century institutions with 21st century ideas. So it's not hopeless, but we need, or the world needs to take another step to try to help institutionalise a lot of these informal arrangements.
Completely agree with the thesis, Rachel. And I've learnt a new acronym in the last couple of weeks, and it's included again in these reports, which is VUCA, VUCA, which is that the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And yet the leadership skills that we have and that are commonly valued and prized in society are those that are completely ill-equipped, according to these reports, to deal with that new, complex, interconnected, interdependent world. Now, this is something that I've seen in the civil service, in politics, and also in the last 5 years in business. There's a huge premium. In fact, conformity is prized. Now, you've seen that in the civil service with, coordination of policy briefings being what civil servants are valued for. You see it in collective responsibility in government. You see it in business, where there's a huge premium being put on being able to execute a strategy rather than being able to think about strategy. And one of the things I was most struck by the last 5 years in banking is that those people that seem to float effortlessly to the top are those that are necessarily ill-equipped to deal, or may well be ill-equipped to deal with the really big strategic challenges facing either the corporate world or indeed society. So that came out very, very strongly in these reports, that we need a new set of leadership skills. We need people who are maverick in the business world. We need people who are maverick in the boardroom. And then we need people who are able and prepared to think the unthinkable or the unpalatable. Well, the Faith and Religion report takes this head on and says leaders in government have to develop a new faith literacy. They have to understand what really does motivate many, many people around the world. And instead of squeezing religion to the margins, as often seems to be happening in a liberal democracy, they ought to take faith groups on as partners in developing the new visions that are needed for the future.
Some really interesting points have been raised already, I think, particularly around the kind of long-term challenges. Something that we talked a lot in the business and finance panel was around leadership in terms of technology, and especially challenges that aren't particularly evident today. So one of those that I'd love to share with you is the challenge of job replacement. So people may have seen it's estimated, an Oxford report estimated that between 35 and 45% of jobs will be automated in the next 10 years. Now, that's very easy to think about kind of conceptually, I guess, but when you actually think about, for example, driving, so around 700,000 people make most of their livelihoods in Britain by driving. One night, over the next coming years, all of those people will lose their jobs. And I think that that's the scale of the kind of challenge with technology, and that's why leadership is so important in those areas today, because it's actually private companies that are driving this change, and they're often completely unregulated, and there's no discussion amongst government or policymakers as to what to do with these changes. And what that means is that you have a company like WhatsApp that was sold for $19 billion, and they had an employee base of like 50 people. If you look historically, that's completely unprecedented. For a company of that value to have that few employees means that actually those few people are incredibly wealthy, and then all the people who aren't employed by that company have no job. So I think that it really comes down to purpose. You know, if you look at companies like Unilever, for example, in sustainability, if you even look at a company like Tata, based in India, that's, I think, 66% owned by foundations, it's not unacceptable for a business to have purpose. A lot of people think that it is, but it's not.
So some of the key sort of factors that I'd like to take out of the report that we came up with is the fact that with regards to leadership and its training, it needs to start being put into the foundations, the grassroots of mainstream education. And this is starting right from primary education. So starting this off at primary, it needs to be nurtured through to secondary and then post-secondary level as well. So we all, in school, you're always taught about great leaders from the past, as well as looking at present leaders who are quite inspirational. However, you're never really taught about the qualities of a great leader and what you need to do to become a great leader. And this is especially crucial in today's generation, as some of the other panelists talked about. We're facing issues that we may not have seen before or weren't highlighted so much previously, such as the rise in technology and the potential, the benefits that it brings, but also the potential problems that it can bring, climate change and so many other issues. And because of all of this, because of all of these sorts of issues, leadership training needs to be implemented from a younger age so that people feel more confident and comfortable progressing on later on in life with this.
The final thing I would say, originally we saw this as a one-year project. We saw it as a series of panels that would look at subjects, including the one that says Thinking the Unthinkable, and I recommend that very much to you today with others. And we said that would be it. We would have a final big conference at this time. And that would be Churchill's legacy on the 50th anniversary, fulfilled. But the more we've gone into the subject, the more we've looked at it, the more the panels have dug deep, the more we've begun to realise that there is actually something more here, and perhaps it needs to continue beyond this year. Having 16 to 18 reports is one thing. We hope they'll be read. But everyone in this room knows only too well what happens to big reports. They lie on shelves unless they are instrumentalised, unless they are taken forward. So I leave that thought with you today, to this audience and to the panels themselves, about how we can actually take it forward, how all of this work can be made the basis for something that is bigger and better. We've proved the need for thoughts of leadership. What we now have to do is to work out how we can actually make sure that we produce leaders of the future, willing and able to take the sobering burdens that are going to be involved in tackling the complicated and dangerous world that we live today.